Thank you so much, everyone. Welcome. And just to briefly introduce Cosmo Imaginaries, this is another session of the Cosmo Imaginaries program, which began as an inquiry into ecologies and technologies at Schumacher College and has since taken root in Aotearoa, New Zealand, thanks to the collaborators at Intercreate and now this newly launched institute. The program supports creative and emerging research practices that expand how we imagine the planetary and outer space, drawing on various long-term engagements with anthropology, with creative practices, with indigenous knowledge. And our focus is on grounding outer space imaginaries in the ecological, in cultural and place-based practices too, practices and research methods that resist extractivist narratives and that cast the cosmos as a frontier of control and profit, and instead drawing on thinkers such as Marisol de la Cadena, Juan Francisco Salazar, and the late great Ursula Le Guin, engaging what Valerie Olsen calls the more than terran, to imagine outer space from within Earth's own relational and value-based systems. So at the dawn of this second space age, as missions to the moon and to Mars accelerate, we're really asking how we can attend to the planet and to space with methods rooted in the relational, in listening, in the contextual, in planetary care and concern for creaturely life. And today's session continues this effort by focusing on animal communication and planetary listening. And it is such a pleasure to introduce Arik Kershenbaum, who I have known for some years now with the UK SETI group, the Search for Extraterrestrial Intelligence. Dr. Arik Kershenbaum is a zoologist at the University of Cambridge and the author of The Zoologist's Guide to the Galaxy. His research spans animal vocal communication and bioacoustic conservation technologies and xenolinguistics. And as I say, I first met Arik in the UK SETI meetings and was struck by how he was bringing in animal communication into that research network, and the possibility of thinking about life beyond Earth in ways that are shaped by and rigorously grounding our imagination in ecological knowledge of the Earth and the ecosystems of Earth. So his work also speaks to these current debates about AI and the various hypey claims that we are about to imminently create a Google Translate for whales. These technological, techno-scientific claims that are made about how we will, decode the secrets of animal communication. I think many in the Cosmo Imaginaries events and network have been highly skeptical of that. And as a kind of contrast, I guess I give creative projects that explore the planetary in more communal and practical ways. So this conversation is such a fitting coda for me, having spent the last weekend listening to the Dawn Chorus as part of Reveil, a 25-hour broadcast following the planet's sunrise through field recordings from all over the world, and hearing the dawn wake up in Aotearoa, Australia, Malaysia, Vietnam, Palestine, and Tel Aviv, and India, and beyond. This protocol, this planetary protocol of technical experimentation and listening, kind of created a possibility to hear the textured creaturely life of the world in such a unique way. And it really brought home how listening to the sound of birds the call of birds tells you things about space, that you can tell if there's mist in the air, you can tell if you're in the tropics, in the way that the call of the birds goes out across the valley. And that feeling of the ubiquitous roosters of the planet representing the sunrise, really, it was profound how it made sense that the rooster's call is a collaborative event with the planet itself, that it can't really be separated from the rising of the sun. And I'm really intrigued as to how Arik looks at things like context and these kind of relational aspects of creaturely existence. So, with that, I will pass over to Arik, who will give a presentation of maybe 40 minutes, however long, and then we really welcome some questions, and I will put two of the priorities that people on the network who could not make it to this discussion have sent me. So thank you so much, Arik. Welcome. Thank you.
Thank you. Thank you. No, that's lovely and really interesting, actually. I mean, I think there's a lot of what you say is really interesting and has got a lot to do with the sort of things that I do. And yeah, I don't know that I'm going to be able to cover absolutely everything that you that you mentioned there. Certainly, a lot of it is the sort of stuff that I do, and that, as you said, there's been a lot of stuff in the news about dolphins and whales, and a lot of that I've been engaging with. I don't think I'm going to talk too much about that, but we can perhaps in the questions afterwards. And Yeah, and context and dawn choruses, all things that I could talk more about, but perhaps we might need to leave that for later. So what I am going to talk about, let's try and do it as let's call it an introductory talk, is about what communication is in the context of what animal communication is, because of course animal communication was there before human communication. And whether we can draw any conclusions, whether there's anything that tells us about fundamental nature of communication in a universal context. How would aliens communicate? Both alien life forms in a complex ecosystem, alien animals, alien plants, whatever the equivalents are, but also those, we could say, technological aliens who are the ones who we might end up communicating with. So unfortunately, we're not going to communicate with alien rabbits and birds and things like that, because we're very, very unlikely ever to get to an alien planet that is inhabited with complex life. But should we ever make contact with with alien creatures, they will be technological creatures. Otherwise, there's no way of us communicating. So we'll see where this goes, and hopefully it'll be useful. And then I'll certainly, we can do some questions at the end. So the first thing that I really want to ask is, I'm assuming you can all see the slides, right? Yeah, good. So what is communication? That's not a trivial question. There's a lot of confusion about what communication is, and particularly there's a lot of confusion between the difference between communication and language. And we get this quite a lot. I often hear people say, well, of course animals have language. They communicate, don't they? And perhaps that's a valid position to take. But perhaps language is something that has a meaning that we should reserve for something a little bit more specific than just communication in general. We will determine whether or not we think that is actually the case. So what is communication? Well, there's a lot of it about, that's for sure, and it takes many different forms. Here's a form of communication. This is me and a wolf cub, actually at a conference of animal communication people. So I see all these professors are all lining up, very excited to communicate to communicate with these animals. So there's communication going on here, but how do we define communication? How do we know that this is communication? Something is happening, but what is it? Well, when it comes to defining communication, you could be very pedantic and you could be very you could be very technical, but there's always a danger that a definition is going to narrow you down to those phenomena that you've already experienced. And what we really want to do is we want to find a definition of communication that can be as universal as possible. And in fact, the definition of communication that we use in animal behavior is something that perhaps is a little surprising. Um, Communication is a signal that one individual sends, is received by another individual, and the behavior of the second individual is changed for the benefit of the sender. That is probably not the first thing you would go to if I asked you for what a definition of communication was. But it's a really good definition. And it's a really good definition for two reasons. One is that it makes no assumptions about what information is in the signal. It makes no assumptions about how that signal is conveyed, what the medium is. And importantly, it makes no assumptions about intentionality. Intentionality in communication is really problematic because we don't really know what animal intention is. Does a bee have intention? Does a bee mean to send a signal to other bees? We can get away from that by using a definition that's purely evolutionary. All it tells us is here's a mechanism that will evolve because it provides an evolutionary advantage, a signal that changes the behavior of other individuals for the benefit of the sender. That's something that will evolve. And as I say, it really, in science, it's much more satisfying to have definitions that are why definitions rather than what definitions. What definitions are very narrow. They're very easily broken by exceptions. Why definitions tell us about mechanisms and they explain to us how the world works. So this is the definition that we use. And under this definition, all animals communicate, all of them, every single one. There's no, and of course, more than animals. The definition applies to plants as well. There's absolutely, if anyone asks, do plants communicate? Well, according to this definition, absolutely they do. They can send signals that end up benefiting an individual by altering the behavior of others. So this is a very, very, very broad definition of communication. Now, the origin of communication is another interesting question and maybe a bit of a surprise. Communication starts with sensation. In other words, we speak, the reason that we speak is because we have ears. It's not the other way around. Organisms, and here you take something like an amoeba or perhaps ants using chemical communication, right? They've evolved to sense their environment because it's advantageous to sense their environment. Once you can sense your environment, you can send signals and other individuals will pick them up. So communication begins with sensation. And that, by the way, is why we don't see any telepathy on Earth. All of our communication channels have evolved from sensing the physical environment, from sensing the non-living environment, finding food, warning of danger. Those are the physical environmental cues that we evolved detection that then evolved into communication. Telepathy doesn't evolve because there's no point in listening out for other people's thoughts if the other people aren't sending their thoughts, and there's no point in sending your thoughts if no one's listening for them. It's a vicious circle, and that's why we don't see telepathy. So, obviously, smell, the oldest form of communication. It's a kind of chemical communication. It's very widespread. Everyone is sniffing everyone else, but it's a really, really restrictive way of sending messages. Smell has a lot of disadvantages. It's very slow. It spreads through the environment very slowly. It's difficult to figure out exactly where it's come from. And they get mixed up. Smells get mixed up. you get two smells and the air moves and then they're all mixed up. It's kind of like you must have heard of the cocktail party phenomenon, where the cocktail party listening to lots of people and it all gets very confusing. Imagine if that was smells. Imagine you're in a cocktail party trying to smell who is there. It's not possible. So smell really hasn't evolved into complex communication. You can have billions and billions and billions of different combinations of smells, but it's almost impossible to deconstruct those and see what message was meant to be there. Vision is another one. Vision is a very, very, very old sensing modality. You can see there's a fossil trilobite with those incredibly complex eyes. It's really been around for a very long time, and pretty much all animals have some sort of vision. This is a box jellyfish on the right there, and those little black spots are photosensitive eye spots. So they're really pretty much across the entire animal world, we see vision. And of course, it's because there is vision that we have so much color in animals. These are signals that the animals are sending one way or another. Today, visual communication is seen very prominently in birds. Colorful birds, bird feathers. It is something that's quite widespread, but it's got some very serious disadvantages. Light doesn't go around things or through things. So if you're standing behind a tree, you can't see what's going on. This is a physical property of light. It's a physical property of the wavelength of light. It just doesn't go around things. So it's great to be really colorful, but a lot of the time, if you're in the jungle or if you're underwater, it's just not a good way of conveying complex information. What is a good way of conveying complex information? Sound. I mean, this is the most widely spread complex communication medium on our planet, because sound does go around things and sound does travel long distances and it does travel quickly. And so it seems to have all of the characteristics that are necessary for complex communication, including one very important one, which I'll come to in a minute. So, as I said, communication arose from sensation. Hearing clearly gives you an adaptive advantage, sensing whether there are predators or where food is. But of course, hearing is only really detecting vibration. They're really the same thing. I've got this just a cute video here from a colleague working with sea lions, and you can see that in this experiment, rather than
station
listen to sound, there's this little plate connected to her whiskers, and then you get a tone, and the tone is not heard; it's just reflected in the vibration of the plate, and she understands that this is one sound or another sound. So vibration and detection of vibration and sound very, very closely linked. So sound, as I said, is particularly useful when you live in a cluttered environment, when you can't necessarily see who's talking to you, either because they're behind a tree or because they're a long way away. Sound seems to be the preeminent method of communication. And sound also can be very, very complex. And that is a really key element. You can have a great deal of variation in the signal that you're sending. And that variation can carry information. Now, we're very familiar with this. This is not something that's unusual. If you look at a complex piece of orchestral music, there's a lot of information there. There is a huge amount of information, and you can see that the subtle changes can make a huge difference in the meaning of the signal. And I said there was an extra thing that made sound very special, and it's this, that we can put an awful lot of information into sound for the same reason that sound goes around things, which is that we can detect different frequencies, in sound using a remarkable organ in our ear that all vertebrates have, that relies on the fact that the way that sound interacts with physical objects. So if you think about it, if you ask any human, even a non-musical person like myself, if you give them a range of musical notes, this is a story attributed to famous evolutionary biologist J.B.S. Haldane. I think it's true, actually. There are a lot of apocryphal stories about him. I think this one is true. That if you give any human a range of musical notes, anyone can order them in ascending frequency. But if you give any human a range of colors, no one can arrange them in order of ascending frequency. And it wasn't until Newton came along and invented the prism that anyone even thought that was an issue. And the reason for that is sound interacts with physical objects and light doesn't. So we have in our if you compare the way that we detect sound and the way that we detect light, the way that we detect light is we have different color detectors. We have a red and a green and a blue detector in our eyes, and we measure how much of those different colors come in. The way our ears work are completely different. We have a series of hairs of varying stiffness and length, and different frequencies move those little hairs differently. That's what sound does. It can move objects, and that gives us the ability to encode huge amounts of information in sound because we can detect so many differences in frequencies. So sound really is, I think, the preeminent communicative medium on a planet like ours with kind of physical, with the physical structure that our planet has. Clearly, if you have a planet with a very thin atmosphere like Mars, sound is not going to be a great way of communicating. But on a planet with a nice thick atmosphere, or with any kind of really thick fluid environment, this is a good way to communicate. There are other ways to communicate. I'm just going to mention one, which is very rare, but also very, very interesting and very promising, and that's electric communication. So there are a couple of genera of fish, electric fishes, that communicate using electricity. And if you look at those waveforms of the different kinds of pulses that they make, you can see there's a lot of potential there for very, very complex communication. Lots of very complex information can be encoded in them. But it's extremely rare. There's really only a handful of species that do this on Earth. And the reason is, of course, that it's incredibly expensive to generate these electric signals, and you need to devote a huge part of your body to being essentially a massive battery. And yeah, anyone who's had their cell phone run out of battery knows that this is it's a problematic way to communicate, which doesn't mean that communication on other planets will not use electric fields. It's a really good way of encoding information. It's just something that on Earth doesn't seem to be very common. So, as a sort of brief view of the different kinds of communication, let's ask ourselves a question about what language is. And here we get into trouble. Here we get into trouble for a couple of reasons. One is that a lot of people have a lot of ideas about what language should be. And in particular, a lot of people have a lot of ideas of whether animals have language or not. If you think animals do have language, then you look for a definition that will include animals in it. If you think animals don't have a language, then you look for a definition that excludes animals from that definition. That's not a very satisfying way to find a definition, to look for one that supports the ideas that you already had. As with communication, we really should find something that is genuinely universal, genuinely uninfluenced by our preconceptions, and then see how it applies. That's one problem. The other problem is that we're talking also about aliens. Can we think of a definition of language that's actually genuinely universal? That if we find a definition of language that works on Earth, will it also work for an alien civilization? And that's a problem because we don't know anything about aliens, or do we not? Um, I would argue we know quite a lot about aliens, in fact, and this was, in fact, the subject of my first book that Kate mentioned. We know that alien life is constrained. It's constrained by the laws of physics, it's constrained by the laws of chemistry, and it's constrained by the laws of biology. There are laws of evolution that tell us a great deal about what alien life can or cannot be. Perhaps some of those laws, and particularly I'm thinking about laws like the kinds of things that are likely to evolve given constraints of given evolutionary constraints. Can we say anything about alien language? Are there any constraints we can place on alien language? Is there something about language that must be shared between ourselves and anyone else who uses language in the universe? This is a question which is a current question. We don't have a simple answer to that, but I think it's got to be our goal. It's got to be our goal to try and find a universal definition that would apply both to all forms of life on Earth and also to any forms of life we would encounter. Of course, what most people do is they try and make a definition based on human language. It is, after all, the only example that we've got. That's where people started. Charles Hockett came up with these ideas that language has to have these 13 characteristics, but they were just 13 characteristics that human language had. Some of them make a lot of sense. Some of them are really quite compelling. It would be difficult to imagine what a language could be like without semantics, without semanticity, without certain signals representing certain concepts. I think it's hard to imagine how you could have a language without that. But to say that you need these 13 properties is no longer convincing anyone. More recently, a group of scientists are often will tell you that there's something very special about the way that words are combined in human language that is absolutely characteristic of what language is. And this idea of context-free embedding, if anyone is familiar with computational linguistics, also not very compelling, simply because it's based entirely on human language. What about animal language? Do animals have a language? Where does that come into how does our definition fit into this? Most scientists would tell you, and this was the subject of my second book, that animals do not have a language. But what does that mean? Why do we say animals don't have a language? And if they did, what would it be like? And what do they have if they don't have a language? Some of them can clearly communicate in quite complex ways. So when looking for those very general definitions of what language might be, we might want to look at some of the universal features that we think might be absolutely essential to what language is. And then we can look and see whether different animals have them. So the sorts of things that people have looked at is complexity. A language presumably needs to be complex in some way. And there are ways that we can measure complexity that I'll talk about in a minute. One of the key features of language, one of the most important ones for me, although there are qualifications to that as well, is that language should probably be unbounded. In other words, there probably shouldn't be a limit to what can be expressed in a language. Now, one of the reasons for this is that it's clearly a property of human language. We'll never run out of things to say. Well, there'll always be more things that we can say. But more than that, it's that unbounded property that has made human language the important tool that it is. It's because of the unbounded nature of our language that we've been able to build spaceships and cities and radio telescopes and try and communicate with aliens. This seems to be something that makes a difference between simple communication and complex communication. And then finally, we need to have there needs to be some sort of semanticity in the language. As I said, a language that doesn't mean anything isn't much of a language. So somehow there needs to be semantics and concepts, although the concept of what a concept is very problematic. I'm not sure that we'll get into that today, but we'll see where we go. So let's start with complexity. Animal sounds are really, really, really complex, okay? There are so many ways. You've heard a lot of bird songs. This one, though, this is a northern mockingbird, and it has so many different, like, hundreds of different notes that it sings. It's mimicking other animals, and it combines them in an incredibly complex way. Whales, mentioned whales. I've sped this one up because humpback whales sing very slowly. But again, we're talking about a sequence of many different sounds combined in a very complex way. There seems to be something complex about the way that the whale is combining the sounds, which is all very well, as long as we know what we mean when we say complexity, when we say it's complex. Here's another animal. This is a rock hyrax. Again, many different notes, combining them in a complex way, possibly. What does it mean? So there's a sequence of notes. There's a sequence of hyrax notes, in fact, in a hyrax song. Is it complex? Is that a complex sequence? What would you say if it was a random sequence? Is a random sequence complex? Now, this takes us to a very interesting and very key concept in animal communication. We need to know what information is. How much information is there in a sequence like that? So if you ask someone whose job is information theory, they will tell you, well, I hope that sequence is random because a random sequence contains the maximum amount of information. But of course, if you ask a biologist, will tell you that a random sequence contains no information at all. So what's going on here? Why do we have this sense that the sequence that you see above, it's complex, and yet if it's random, it's in some way not complex. It's actually empty. It has no meaning at all. So what we do to sort of solve this problem is use a metric of complexity called entropy. Entropy is a measure of randomness, essentially. It's a measure of predictability, how easy it is to predict the next note in a song, for instance. In a random sequence, it's not possible to predict the next note in a song. So a random sequence is very high entropy, and a predictable sequence has very low entropy. And when we measure animal sequences and measure the complexity in terms of entropy, we resolve the problem on the previous slide by noting that a sequence or a signal with high entropy has the maximum amount of potential information, but it doesn't necessarily have any intentional information. This is coming back to our definition of communication, where I said it's good that we don't say anything about intention. But without saying anything about intention, it's extremely difficult to know whether we're talking about a sequence that's complex because it has a lot of information, or a sequence that's complex because it's random. And entropy is a confusing concept, and it's one that's often misunderstood. It's not quite the same thing as complexity. And I'm going to try and explain that and give an example. Let's assume that we have a bird that can sing 5 different notes, okay? A, B, C, D, and E. Now, there's a number of different ways that this bird could use those 5 different notes. So he might use one note predominantly, in this case A, occasionally singing a few B's or C's or something like that. But basically, he's singing A, 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 A. This is not a complex signal, okay? There's no way that you would call that a complex signal. Basically, he's saying A. That's the message. And this signal indeed has low entropy. The other thing that he could do is use those notes in such a way that they're all pretty much the same probability. I've ordered them here in decreasing probability, but they're all basically the same. Now, in this case, he's singing a very complex song. It's not really possible to predict which note will come next because they're all equally likely. So this is a maximal entropy song. And you would think that it has the most amount of information in it. And indeed, it has the largest amount of potential information in it. Would we expect language to be like this? Perhaps if we see a song or a signal like this, we could say, really complex, lots of potential information, probably language. But that's not what we find. If you look at human language, for instance, humans don't do either of these two things. Humans do this. They have a very particular relationship between the probabilities of the different signals that they send. And this manifests itself if you look at our word use in English, for instance. The second most common word in English, of, is half as common as the most common word. And the third most common word is a third as common. And that very, very striking pattern continues all the way down. So the 10,000th most common word in this particular corpus that I looked at, it turned out to be barracudas, is 1/10,000th as common as the word the. And this is something that is found across all human languages. This is called Zipf's law. And you see it in every language. We see the same relationship that the nth most common word is 1/nth as common as the most common word. Very, very, very remarkable phenomenon. We do not use the most complex way of combining symbols. We use something slap bang in the middle, halfway between as complex as it could be and as simple as it could be. And there are a lot of people who have postulated and as in this example here, done mathematical simulations that indicate that this is actually an evolutionarily advantageous phenomenon, that it is good to balance complexity between the most complex possible and the simplest possible. And that's because complex signals are really difficult to interpret. If you have a lot to say, you want to make your signal as complex as necessary, but no more. And this is probably why we find all human languages conforming to the Zipf's law. Complexity is not just about entropy. If you consider these three glasses of coffee, clearly the one on the left has low entropy. All of the milk is in one part, all of the coffee is in the other. The one on the right, they're completely mixed. There's no way of telling whether you've got milk or coffee there, high entropy. But anyone will tell you that both the glass on the left and the glass on the right are very simple. The complex glass is the one in the middle, the one where there's some sort of structure, there's something going on there, but we can't quite tell what it is. So complexity in communication is it's a balance between complexity and simplicity. This is the kind of thing we want to be looking for. If we want to see signatures of language or signatures of complex communication, look to see whether the complexity is well balanced or whether it's at one extreme. So that's complexity. Now let's think about the unbounded nature of language. Does language need to be unbounded? Well, maybe. There are certainly some people who feel that language is something that is qualitatively different from all forms of communication. So we can ask ourselves, is it possible to say that there's a scale of languagelessness from no language on the left to proper language, human language if you like, on the right? Full language, 100% language or 0% language. And then everywhere in between is a bit of language. some 50% language, something like that. And we could say, if we were so inclined, that we're going to measure that by the number of concepts that you can convey. So most animals can convey a handful of concepts, a handful, 10, maybe 20 different concepts maximum. They may only have 20% language. Does that make sense? Is that a definition that we're happy with? Or would we prefer to say that language is that thing at the right-hand side, 100% language, and the blue line never reaches the right-hand side, right? It's asymptotes to the right-hand side, never actually reaches it. Maybe we need a qualitative step that takes us from this sort of language-ness to true language. And this is not a resolved question. Animals don't, as far as we know, there's not a single species, not dolphins, not chimpanzees, none of them that have this sort of unbounded capacity for language. They don't have it. And maybe that makes them qualitatively different. But maybe it doesn't. And the key thing here is that when we talk about language being unbounded, we're looking retrospectively at our own language, which is unbounded. But does language actually have to be infinite? It wasn't. We certainly didn't need language to be infinite. Do we need language to be infinite now? Even when we build a spaceship, it's a finite instructions manual. It's not actually infinite. But more importantly, it's very hard to see how having an infinite language capability would actually benefit anyone. Why would it be an evolutionary advantage to have infinite language capacity? Certainly our ancestors didn't need to build spaceships. And so the idea that we can define language as from its infinite nature is highly problematic because its infinite nature doesn't seem to provide an evolutionary advantage. Now there are ways around this, which I could go into, but as time is running, perhaps I won't. I'm going to move on. We could talk about that in the discussion if you like. I'm going to move on very briefly to talk about this idea about concepts, the idea about semanticity. It's very hard for us to say that we know what concepts are. Clearly, when we talk to other humans, we can ask, what do you mean by the color red? And all the famous philosophical quandaries about whether qualia are in some way shared. But at least we can talk about them. We can't do that with animals. The point that I want to raise, which is really important for when we think about both about animals and about aliens, is that we speak in discrete symbols, words, essentially. We have a word which is a semantic representation, even if that semantic meaning varies with context and so on. Many animals have signals that are not discrete. So here's an example of dolphin whistles. You could see that visual representation, so that shows the pitch with time. And if you're young enough, you'll be able to hear the whistles. The pitch goes up and down, up and down. And with dolphin whistles, we're fortunate that we know that there are some whistles that have a particular meaning. They have a name. Dolphins have names for themselves. They use these signature whistles very often. We can spot them, identify them very clearly. And we say, okay, this is a whistle that is the dolphin's name. But the problem is that those whistles are never exactly the same. So here's an example of however many signature whistles of a single dolphin. And if you overlay them on each other, you can see that actually the way the pitch varies, I mean, it's kind of similar, but it's never exactly the same. Well, does that mean that they each have a different meaning? Does it mean that it's a kind of subtle variation in the meaning, or some perhaps emotional modulation? We don't know. We don't know how the dolphins perceive these. Or do they perceive them as exactly the same whistle? Or do they perceive them as subtly different ones? This is a big problem when you think about how concepts are encoded by other species. If you don't know what their cognitive interpretation of these environmental signals are, we cannot know whether we're talking about different concepts in a single signal. And graded signals like these are very, very difficult to keep the same every time. They're always going to be different every time. Maybe a system of communication using graded signals like dolphins simply isn't a good system for a language. Maybe that's why dolphins don't have a language. Maybe they're constrained to use signals that aren't easy to interpret. So there's one thought. Even in animals that have discrete sounds, it becomes extremely complicated, extremely difficult to know how they're interpreting them. We don't even know what their communicative units are. When we see a bird song, when we see, for instance, these bird songs here that are made up of multiple notes, do they perceive them as separate notes, or do they perceive it as one unit, which is a note in itself? We really don't know. It's very, very difficult to know where that conceptual information lies, which is not very good. We're not doing a very good job of understanding what language is and what the potential for it is. However, I'm going to finish by going over some of the points that a group that myself and a group of other people raised at a workshop of the SETI Institute a number of years ago. What animal studies can tell us about detecting intelligent messages from outside of Earth? There are a handful of separate conclusions that I think are important to bear in mind. First one is it possible that there are these sort of general principles of communication, principles that are evolutionarily dictated? So something that if language evolves on Earth and it evolves on another planet, they'll both be constrained by the same constraints. If so, we should be looking for these. And the kind of things that I'm talking about are, for instance, this balance between complexity and simplicity. Balance between complexity and simplicity seems to be something that's evolutionarily plausible. Stay agnostic to the communication medium. It could be electric, it could be visual, it could be smells even in some contexts. But is there something that is an evolutionary constraint? What do we mean when we say meaning? This is not a simple question. Intuitively we think that intentionality is something important, but it's very difficult to define intentionality. We need to think about the niche in which a particular organism has evolved and what the relationship between two communicating individuals is. Is it mutualistic? Is it exploitative? What's the nature of the potential meaning in signals? It's a very interesting question how complex communication evolved from simple communication. We don't know that. We don't know it in humans. We don't really know what was that process by which we arrived at this really, really complex communication. We need to know whether there's some sort of overarching evolutionary drive towards complexity. Can we think of any fingerprints? Can we think of anything that if we got a signal from an alien or from an animal for that matter, that we could say, okay, it has these statistical properties, therefore it's likely to be language. And this is a very active field of research at the moment. Again, do we see a scale of languageness in animals on Earth? Is it the case that you either have language or you don't have language? Or is it the case that you have this sort of gradation, you have some sort of proto-language that evolves eventually into something that we would call language? And finally, as I mentioned, how on earth do you determine what are the communicative units? Is it graded signal? Are they discrete signals that may be combined into larger units? How do we go about researching that? And the best way to go about researching that, if we're thinking about alien language, is to look at animal communication on Earth, because animals seem to have almost the whole range of possibilities of different ways of encoding information on Earth. So by looking at what animals do, we get a lot of ideas about different ways of encoding information without thinking only of human language. So to summarize, Just because animals have complex communication does not mean that they have language. That's not the same thing. Um, Aliens, if we're going to talk to them ever, must have a language because they must be able to build their radio telescope or spaceship or whatever it is. Um, we cannot define language only based on our language, but we have a lot more information in terms of animal communication. It doesn't have to be animal language, but looking at the variety, the variation in animal communication is a very good way to start thinking about the different ways that communication could exist on other planets. And that's the end of what I had to say.
Thank you so much, Arik. That was such a rich and grounded presentation, and so helpful to directly to some of the priorities that the Cosmo Imaginaries Network held, which was this need for a deeper, more specific understanding of animal communication and bringing out these affordances offered by material contexts and the way that you've carefully unpacked sensorial and material processes at play, and these wide open questions about how meaning arises from that. I found it so valuable. Uh, I think there were two, I guess, themes to flag, but I'll also pass it to everyone here so we can find out what's really animated as the question to dig into. I think one of them was around how the feeling states, emotional states, the difference between the actual infinite and the feeling of the infinite. I think that because art practices, for example, often really use that sense of emotional connection and feeling, that it can complicate a rigorous understanding of what we mean by the infinite, say, because we like there's something really to dig into there about that question of whether communication and language can extend infinitely, or whether our feeling states, our emotion states, can sense something which is infinite. I hope that you can draw out something sensible from that. And the other thing really was just thinking about material practices or research or knowledge making, such as, say, acoustic research, because that's very much your research and what I've been immersed in the last weekend with the Reveil project. How doing those practices can transform the understanding of the actual researcher or the understanding of the practitioner, and how that kind of makes more palpable and tangible a sense of the planet itself as a co-constituted communicative system in which we are already participants, which connects with various understandings across cultures, across, I'm thinking of people like Hildegard von Bingen's sense of the earth as a resounding, musical, expressive, relational living being. So that kind of reframing of communication through material research practices. So let me open it to people on the call. I would love to hear your sense of the questions that are living in you, having listened to Arik.
I've got a quick one. And first of all, thank you, Arik, for such a wonderful presentation. It's coming from someone whose practice isn't in that space. I'm just, I'm thankful and appreciative of the, additional kind of interesting cues that I can draw into my own kind of creative practice as well. So that's amazing. But one thing that's always crossed my mind is this, that we talk about sound maybe as the key sensory kind of discussion today. And I found that maybe sound is always, there was this recent journal paper on the Martian soundscape. I think it was on a Nature journal, I believe. And they were trying to make sense of what's happening in the atmosphere, using that to define how a CO2 laden atmosphere might sound like. And the one thing that has come to my mind is that sound has always been transposed or quantized, right, to suit our human ears. And we're always using a way to scale these ranges into something that we can actually hear and appreciate and maybe study. Perhaps the same thing with, false color, astronomy. And it suggests that the tooling that we might have today might not be the most sensitive instruments, I suppose, beyond human sensing. And I wonder what your thoughts are on that aspect. Are we do we lack the sufficient knowledge to even craft or create the right listening or instruments to understand what's happening in the animal kingdom?
I think we do. I mean, clearly, there are, as was mentioned in the chat, there are sounds that we don't hear.
Yeah.
And our own acoustic range is centered in more or less what's available in the animal world. But sometimes that's exaggerated. It's true that bats and dolphins to some extent use higher frequencies than we can hear. Elephants use lower frequencies that we can hear, but it's not that extreme. Okay, we are pretty much centered in that range, and we're centered in that range for the reason that I mentioned, which is that it's the way that sound interacts with physical objects. To build a detector for very, very, very low frequency sounds is actually very difficult. And animals won't have that. So we're not that far out of the range of what we can do. We can take back recordings and reduce the frequencies so that we can hear them, or we can represent them visually as I showed you there, which is what most scientists do. And so because our technological instruments are more than sufficient for detecting the entire range of realistic acoustic frequencies. Yeah, we can look at them all. I mean, I have a colleague who works on elephant rumbles and infrasonic stuff, and yes, you need a different kind of seismic sensor to detect that. But basically, once you've got the sensor in the ground, then you analyze it exactly the same way. We're pretty much in that window, right in the middle of what's possible because of the physical limitations. And the same, by the way, for vision. People make a fuss about how our visual field is slightly smaller than across the entire animal kingdom, but it's not that much smaller. There are no animals that detect radio waves. It's not physically possible. So we're okay. We're not that far out.
Mm.
I like what Kate was saying about emotion and about sensing. What can your Dawn Chorus project do? And I think it can do a huge amount, because one of the biggest problems that humans have in understanding animal communication, thinking about animal communication, always thinking about it as a human, always as a human. It's like you cannot have original ideas. You're just constantly comparing everything to humans. And the best solution for that is to get away from the humans and go and sit with the animals themselves. And whether this is in the jungle or whether it's just at the bottom of your garden, it doesn't matter. It's that idea of immersing yourself in what the animals themselves are doing and seeing and listening to them as animals, not as, I don't know, human accompaniment or something like that. That's really important. And that's one of the things that we find in our field, even if it's not formally formalized in the way that you're doing, is that when you take a student and you sit in the jungle for 2 weeks, and then that's the only way they're going to get to understand how to think about animal sounds. Yeah, it's the only way to do it.
Absolutely. And I mean, just thinking about more than human emotion, that idea of the sensory being fundamental to meaning making And affective neuroscience would argue emotion as fundamental, or at least it's an interesting connection of how we perceive our body sensing that influences how we make meaning, because it's so effective, emotion, and perhaps, how we derive metaphor. Could we imagine non-human emotion? Can we imagine how do you go about exploring this weird affective capacity when you're thinking about the more cosmic questions of intelligence or technological intelligence in the cosmos?
But I don't think it's difficult at all. I think if anything, it's the easy part. If you
Really?
think about your communication with your pets, what do you understand with your pets? Do you understand the
Hungry.
rational thoughts? No, you understand their emotions. It's we're actually very good at that.
Yeah.
That part of it's pretty easy. Um, and a lot of that has got to do with the fact that emotions are again a very evolutionary constraint. It's the same, finding food is pretty fundamental, and fear and certainly in social animals like dogs and humans, social company, having company it's a fundamental need. So it's really easy to say, oh, emotions, we humans have
Mhm.
have the better hand on emotions, but we don't really. Emotions is the thing that we totally share with animals. It's our rationality that is very different. So I don't see that as a problem.
Okay, fantastic. Grant, do you have a question brewing in you?
Oh, thank you, Kate, for prompting me. Yeah, that was really great. I really enjoyed it, and such a straightforward presentation that was really easy for me to understand, given that I'm not working in the same space as you. I really appreciate it, and I have a lot of random thoughts, which probably need a bit of time to coalesce. But anyway, I'll dive in. The first sentence that you put up, the first statement you put up, which I don't remember exactly, which was about sending information to the receiver to the benefit of the sender. Was that correct?
Yeah, I mean, I can put it up again, but yes, it was a signal sent by one individual and received by a second individual, and changes the behavior of the second individual to the benefit of the first.
Right. I thought about that, and I wonder what you would think about changing the end of it to say the benefit of both.
So so okay, at its fundamental level, the definition that I gave is what communication is. What happens then, inevitably, is that mutualistic communication evolves. So whenever you have communication, whenever you have the ability to communicate, you will get cooperative communication evolving. It's evolved from a purely selfish beginning, but and this is a wider conversation about what about how evolution works. But no two individuals of the same species are completely unrelated. No, everyone's related to some extent. So almost always when you're communicating with another member of your species, you're communicating with a family member. And therefore there's advantages, there are evolutionary advantages to helping your family member. So communication, cooperation evolves almost inevitably on the back of communication. Now, the definition that I gave is the purer definition because there are cases where communication is purely selfish. But yes, in the real world, almost all of it has that mutualistic element to it as well.
Okay, that's one. That's one random thought. The other random thought was sort of based on what Kate was saying about the affective, about thinking and feeling, and about the poetic. So, like in the last 15 years in my community, I have noticed, and I haven't done any kind of analysis of this really, but the exchange of information is less effective in creating social change in my community than the poetic or the effective, if that makes sense. And so another kind of parallel kind of random thought is I'm thinking about the role of mycelium and the way that communicates between different forms of plant life. And apparently plant life alters their behavior or their trajectories or whatever according to the information or the communication they're having via mycelium. Hopefully those two random thoughts make sense.
Yeah, that makes sense. I'm not sure. I try to link them perhaps, but so the first case is an interesting one because it reveals something very important about language. The moment that language evolves, as it did in our ancestors whenever, million years ago or whatever it was, then you get a very dramatic change in the way that individuals interact. And in particular, the way that individuals prioritize and plan. And ironically, the fact that we can use language to do long-term planning means that we never do. I will explain this. In evolutionary terms, if you have an organism, a bacterium or something like that, that's just evolving, the only thing that's affecting its behavior is what it's evolved to do, its instinct. And evolution is a very, very long-term process. So any behavior that's evolved to be an instinct has evolved over millions of years. So it's going to be adapted to be advantageous over millions of years. The moment that you can communicate using language, we are in an immediate world. We're in a short-term world. And those long-term, those sort of million-year, thousands of year advantageous outcomes no longer hold sway. And you look at the climate crisis. Do people care about whether their grandchildren will have a world to live in? No, they care about going to work and making their money today. And that's language that's doing that. It's language. That language has swamped any evolutionary trend for long-term stability. And that's why you cannot rely on language, or you cannot rely on this sort of rational this rational representation of ideas to do that long-term planning, because it's essentially short-term. It does more for us figuring out how to make money short-term than it does for us figuring out how to save the planet long-term. And maybe poetics bypasses that in some way.
Great, thank you.
And I guess there's that poetic perception, which I guess I tried to reference by thinking about the mystics like Hildegard von Bingen, who centrally say the resounding earth as the communicative body, and then the creaturely life as almost faculties of sensing of that larger body. And a lot of the kind of conflicts in different meetings that I've been at has been around where we draw those lines, and I wonder if poetry allows us to move more fluidly between what is seen as what is sensing, what is communication, is the cosmos communication, or is it something that we are doing? So may I drop you in it, Alistair? Is there a question brewing on communication?
Well, currently I'm thinking, gosh, maybe we should just abolish language to solve climate change. I think we should seriously consider this matter, and then maybe that would just be would be a great thing anyway. But actually, I was thinking of something different, which is more about work that I do, and I guess there is a sort of element and a link here to technology. So I think it's a bit of a tangent, but hopefully a relevant one. And I've been looking a lot into AI, as anyone involved in technology unavoidably does these days, and exploring, the issues around language and communication and epistemic impact of AI, and you have these issues like model collapse, which I think one of the things with AI now is when you look at the language, the issue is not that it's not very good, but actually that it's indistinguishable. And yet, when you see things like model collapse, what you can see is that there's a structural change in what it's producing as to what humans produce, which is corrupting the actual AI models themselves. You feed that AI generated text back into the models, and then they start over time, over iterations, they start producing gobbledygook because there's something fundamentally different which we can't really discern. Anyway, I was looking at this whole issue and what it means for human language, that so much of our language is going to be, and our information space is now AI generated, and we can't discern between it, and what that means for us. And I think there are lots of serious implications there. But it has occurred to me, and I was thinking about this. We have all of these projects, and we mentioned this at the start, of people using AI to process and analyze more than human sounds and communication, whale songs, we talked about dolphins, etc. Is there a risk here? Because obviously these projects will inevitably get to the point where they'll go, oh, look at this, we can take this, we can discern something, these patterns, turn it into something, and then we can start communicating. Is there a risk that if we do that, we'll sort of introduce all sorts of different elements and some degree of epistemic pollution, interference in animal communication as well as we are with human communication? And it just concerns me that we could be doing something really horrifically terrible.
I think it's unlikely. It's a very interesting concern. Hadn't thought of that. I do think it's unlikely for a couple of reasons. One, because all of this is media hype. There is no research to interpret animal language. It's just not happening. Even the people who say they're doing it are doing it because that's an easy way to raise research money. But if you look at the papers they actually put out, there's a group called Project SETI with a C,
Right.
That raises a lot of money on this basis. But if you actually look at their scientific papers, they're actually straight up animal communication scientific papers. Right? The recent news about Google and the dolphins. I know the researcher who does that. She does proper research. And we all use a lot of machine learning tools for analyzing these sounds. This is how we break them down into different elements and ask questions like, are these two whistles the same whistle or different whistles? These are machine learning tools that are not large language models. It's the large language models that everyone is scared of.
Yes.
And if there's no language, there's no large language model.
Mhm.
What's more than that, I'm sure these massive LLMs have been trained on billions of samples from the internet. The biggest animal communication research project around has maybe tens of thousands of samples. It's just not even. It's orders of magnitude out of the ability. So it's all. I'm not worried about that at all. There's a more fundamental element to what you ask, which is quite interesting. And although obviously there's concern that human language might be affected by interacting with these AI generated texts, it doesn't seem to be happening. It doesn't seem to be a big problem. And I think the reason is that human language did not evolve as an LLM. Human language did not evolve so that we could speak language. We're fairly sure, still controversial, but the consensus is human language evolved as an epiphenomenon on top of our social brains. So we evolved the cognitive ability to speak language as part of our cognitive ability to interact in large communities, complex interactions. And the language just came on top of that. So our brains are not. So when you have a system like an LLM that is built to be language and trained to be language, it is fundamentally different from something that was built to be social interactions, trained to be social interactions, and then language came on top of that.
Mhm.
Um, and, I'm not saying that in the future we won't have AI language systems that are based more on the human brain, but LLMs are not based on the human brain.
Mm.
And so that's kind of insulation against risk there, I think, a little bit.
Yeah. Angelika, I don't want to drop you in it, but if you do have a question, you're very welcome.
Thank you so very much. It was a really inspiring presentation by Arik and all of this discussion. I'm an astronomer, and we are actually doing detection of the signals through, I'm mostly in electromagnetic domain, optical time domain, and astronomy. Now we have the various types of the messengers, angels, because messenger in Greek language is angel, that are actually bringing information to us, like, for example, space-time itself, that is the gravitational waves, and so we have this problem to translate the signals from the other worlds into something that is human interpretable, that we can understand, to transform the geometry, to transform actually that is the more engineering inverse problem, that we actually make the model of the object mostly based on the signals. So maybe for Arik, question about how much, for example, is any type of the life form communication on our planet is actually shaped by the physical parameters of actually geophysical parameters that we have on our planet, and for example, how maybe we can extrapolate some things from what we know here to some other planets, and just idea about this. Thank you.
Yeah, absolutely. And there are plenty of examples of where communication systems are very, very much shaped by the physical environment. So, classic example, if you have ever noticed that birds that live in forests tend to have very tonal notes. They tend to whistle a lot. Birds that live in grasslands tend to trill a lot. They have much less tonal songs. All to do with the propagation, whether it's an open environment or a leafy environment. You see that quite a lot. The best example, though, is our dolphins and our wolves. They have evolved these graded continuous frequency modulated signals precisely because of the environment they live in. They need this wolves need this long range communication. Amplitude modulation in sound does not propagate over long distances. You cannot use it. Frequency modulation is the only way to do it. Similarly, underwater, all that AM information is lost. So they've evolved those signals, those kinds of signals, because of their physical environment. However, when you are looking for signals from aliens, we have a different problem, which is that these signals are passing through a vacuum. So they're presumably radio signals or possibly light signals, and hopefully not gravitational waves, but let's hope not anyway. We have two possibilities. One is that the aliens know that we're here or suspect that we're here and are sending us a message because they want us to understand it. And the other is that it's just leakage from their world. So just like our radio and television signals are streaming out into space, and anyone could pick those up. So maybe it's the same with alien communication. Those are the two kinds of signals we could pick up. If it's the former, if it's meant for us, it will be designed to be as easy to detect and interpret as possible. That's what we would do. So there is no doubt if we were to pick up a signal from an alien that was an intentional signal, we would know it immediately, because they would say, how do we make a signal that another scientist on another world would know it immediately? They'll make it easy for us. If it's leakage, we have the opposite problem, which is that actually our communication, to be energy efficient, has been compressed. All of our wireless communication is compressed for efficiency. And so it actually appears random. There are no statistical signatures in it because it is maximal compression. So it's extremely, and this is a fundamental problem in SETI. It's like, what are we actually looking for? Are we looking for leakage? It's going to look like random noise. Are we looking for a beacon? It's going to be obvious. So how we navigate that is not trivial, but addressing your point, coming back and addressing the dolphin wolf thing, if we were to get a signal that we were confident was a signal and we tried to decode it, then we could run up against a problem that this could be a species that communicates using a graded communication system. And we would struggle a great deal to decode that because we haven't thought about how information could exist in, if these intelligent technological aliens have evolved underwater, for instance, they may have whistles like dolphins, and then we don't have a good example of how that would play out. So it's kind of challenging. I do actually have to go teach at some
of course.
point.
No, I was going to land this, but I guess that my last point would be that sometimes creative play or creative practice is one way to get into imagining this all these unknowns that you're speaking about. And I really appreciate how you just opened the lid on these vast questions in your last comment, and understanding the potential or communication strategies for alien intelligence, or the unintentional, and how it embroils the universal principles of how information might be encoded and transmitted across different species. And yes, there are so many questions brewing in me on musicality, on the feeling of the infinite, complexity and entropy, compression and delay. So I suggest to the group that we keep them cooking. And obviously, if you want to write them down and make contact again, you are very welcome to reach out. I can pass them on to Arik. But now for me, I think contemplating the order and chaos of my next cup of coffee is on the cards. And for you, Arik, you go to teach, and a mixture of good nights and good mornings to the rest of everybody in this room. Again, thank you so much, Arik, for sharing your knowledge.
Thank you, everyone. Thank you, everyone, for coming along.
Thank you.
Thanks very
Have a
much.
nice day, evening.
Thank you. Kia ora.
Bye.
Thanks.
Bye. Thank you.